Hey, everybody. Welcome to Outpost Gray. I am your host, Jack Scott. And if this is your first time here, you are in the right place. Every week, I try to provide you information in cybersecurity, innovation, and technology. And I do that by having experts on the show. And I do that either by having one-on-one interviews like we're going to have today with an amazing guest who I'm going to be talking about here shortly, or I have panel discussions, or what we like to call fireside chat. So if this is your first time here, again, welcome. Also, anybody, it's my repeat offenders. You guys are amazing. You're the reason I do this. So thank you so much. Also, it would mean the world to me if this is your first time here. Hit that subscribe button. I know you're going to love this video, so go ahead and like it and then share it out with others. You guys are the best. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, a couple of my favorite topics outside of just cybersecurity, but we're going to nerd out on a couple of different topics that have been recently in the news. The National Cybersecurity Strategy, that just came out recently, and there's some topics of discussion within the National Cybersecurity Strategy that we're going to talk about. So some of the things will include active cyber defense. We're also going to be talking about one of the oldest laws that you've heard about probably within this space, called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. And we're also going to be talking about a law that never was actually made it past the committee, and it was pretty controversial when it came out. And we're going to be talking about it, which is the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, also ACDC. So I would go ahead and Google that because you're going to want to pull that up during this discussion. But let's talk about the guest that we're going to have on the show and that expert we're bringing on here to talk about these topics. Our guest today, he has over 30 years of experience in IT and cyber. He has a wide range of positions that he's worked in. He's ran his own company, so he's done that executive role. He's also been the chief of information. He was a chief of information security officer for DARPA, which is a really big deal if you guys know what DARPA is and what DARPA does. Also, Scott Rubin, he serves as a director at one of the big four company firms and also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And he teaches in the master's program for intelligence studies and cybersecurity risk management. And Scott and I have been friends for, I want to say like 3 years now. And I also go to Georgetown, and I'm really excited to have him on the show today because we're going to be discussing some of these amazing topics, which he's an expert on. So let's stop me from talking. Let's get him on the stage, right? All right, here we go, guys. All right. Scott, welcome back to Outpost Gray. I'm loving this background. Where are you?
Good morning. It is so exciting to be here again. I love being on your channel. I love being part of your educational journey, as well as, what you do in the space. You do so many great things. I'm in my basement. I got started in technology as a kid. We bought a foreclosed home. And I wish cameras were cheaper back then because the photos would have been amazing. It was a time capsule. The house had been abandoned for 17 years and no one had been in it. Nothing had been moved. And there was a pinball machine. It's not on camera here, but there was a machine in that home. And my dad and I begged my mother that we keep it. And she said, okay, fine. So we kept it. And my father wrote a longhand letter to Williams Electronics, who made the thing, and said, can you send us any documentation or any? And they did. They were so kind. They for free mailed us the schematics. And my father taught me what he knew. I learned how to read a schematic at 12. And thus was a couple things born, was the troubleshooter in me. I loved troubleshooting mechanical things. So now I'm troubleshooting this electromechanical thing. It was electromechanical. The digits rolled over like in the old Happy Days TV show. This was not a solid state digital machine. It was a mechanical state machine. And it was noisy and it was dangerous. It's all AC voltage. And I got shocked a lot. Maybe that's why I'm bald. And my mother thought it was garish and disgusting and loud. It's a lot of pink colors and, and very, very dated artwork. So it ended up in my bedroom. So I had this pinball machine in my bedroom. That's so cool. Two things. I got really, really good at pinball. And then the second thing is I got this passion for electrical things. Like, how do schematics work? How do these different devices work? How does this turn into something active? And then that became my life. So that launched me into technology, into solid state technology, and then ultimately in the Air Force into cryptographic systems and space satellite communication systems. All that was born out of this passion I had. I also was blessed in high school. I was part of a great trade program, Skills USA. Give a shout out to them. Skills USA was VICA back then, and they sponsored all the materials and tools and things we had for our vocational program. So I was a kid that lived in that program, and it gave me my start before the military. So I maintain it to this day. I'm close to my original passion, and I have an arcade at my house.
I've got to get over there. Yeah, we talk about that. So it might happen on graduation. Head over there, play some. Do your kids go down there ever and play? Or is it kind of one of those things where once you have it, you're kind of like,
It's an interesting question. And my kids do play, but not passionately. There's a PlayStation behind me with a projector screen that they'll gravitate to. And the reason I think is I read this paper a number of years ago on pop culture and aging population and when things become collectible. This university did a study. And what they found was that this is powerful to me because of how I grew up. And the avatar is the ball, right? That's really the thing that's manifest here. But when you can have a 120-inch projector screen and a Call of Duty soldier, that's your avatar.
Yeah.
That's powerful. So the avatar is actually superhuman compared to you. So the act of playing, my kids will have their friends over from, I'd say, 10 to 18. And, right away, if they touch it, they're going to play. Or if they have their hands in their pockets and they lean over like it could hurt them, they peer in and they won't touch it. And like they're not sure what to do.
Right.
So, I don't take it personally. I realize that this is not maybe powerful as an entertainment item to a kid these days when there's so many things they can do that make them superhuman. So it's a mix.
That's so cool. Yeah, I would be all up on it. I remember playing pinball when I was a kid. We used to go to Pizza Hut on like Friday or Saturdays, and you get the quarters, or 4 quarters you could play for probably a half hour. It's not like that anymore. I think it's like $2 to play pinballs, but I miss it. I was so much fun. Yeah. So
we'll have you and your classmates over. Everything's working thanks to COVID. I got every single machine working.
Yes.
We'll have a fun little fun tournament. It'll be laugh.
I love that. All right. So let me really quick set the stage for everyone, and then I'm going to kick it off with one of the questions that I have lined out here. So before we begin, I just want to make sure kind of we're on the same page for all of the viewers watching this, because we're going to really dive into some topics. And I think it's really important that we really set the stage of the discussions that we're going to have. So really laying out that legal landscape surrounding everything. So to set the stage, we'll first be defining some of the key concepts here, which include the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. And then we're going to talk about the act that didn't make it past the committee, which was the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, also known as ACDC, which I love that. And we're going to talk about the differences between active cyber defense and hacking back. And then once we have kind of that solid understanding of these definitions, these bills, these topics, we'll then explore and deep dive into some questions such as, for example, why is the current laws may favor attackers? Because that's really kind of one of the things that I want to dive into. And then why ACDC failed and how the recent release of the National Cybersecurity may impact the field. So, I want to kick it off since I framed that. Now I want to just kick it off and us kind of talk about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, which is a federal law that criminalizes computer-related offenses, such as accessing computers without authorization or exceeding authorization access to obtain information. So in your opinion, Scott, how important is the CFAA in protecting computer systems and data from criminals? And the second part of that, do you feel that this act is still relevant today, or does it need to be updated?
So excellent questions. And as we often joke, I'm not an attorney. I work with a lot of attorneys. As I made my way through my field from military intelligence and then civilian work I've done, what makes a law powerful and valid, right? What makes case law, right? First, we have to go to the understanding that we don't just come up with case law out of the clear blue and modify it willy-nilly and tack on ideas and change it. The law, whatever aspect we're looking at, has some kind of foundational, fundamental aspects that work, and then it becomes precedent, right? And it's precedent for a very long time if it's done right. If the court got it right, and it reflects what our founding fathers and what good jurisprudence expect, that law is going to last, right? Things like robbery and assault and battery, right? we fundamentally get what those concepts are, and the laws that protect us from the people who would perpetrate those things against us, stick around. My father-in-law is an attorney, and we were discussing when he first got out of law school, he was defending drunk drivers. And he said, the book for U.S. drunk drivers is about this thick. It's all the case law you might ever use. And he would always say to me, you're not going to say to a judge and a prosecutor when you're defending a drunk driver that you're going to come up with some crazy set of ideas to invent new case law. Everyone's going to get excited, and you're probably going to get blown out, because creating new case law fundamentally is just going to set up this incredible stage of work of appeals and, and reviews and, more trials and on and on and on. So he said, most attorneys are looking at precedent. And when precedent works, when you look at like some of those crimes and cases, they're quite old. You go pick out a case from a trial that was for a drunk driver or for robbery. It's based in very old case law. So 1986, right?
Yeah.
The CFAA, still here. It's not that old, but it's I'm 51. But
it compared to technology and how quickly, yeah.
So why is it still here?
Yeah.
Why does it work? Why am I don't say I'm a fan of it, but why do I think it still works? Well, and this is, we're going to head into this with AC/DC. It's very tricky to come up with, the kind of legislation and the kind of things that happen at trial based around technology, right? There's layers, sort of like the OSI model, right? If we're on the very, very forefront of the pointy end of the spear of the technology, we're probably dealing with something that will be passé at some point, right? I could probably come up with 100 peripherals that you go back in your mental wayback machine. Say, I remember that thing, but we don't have it anymore. We don't need it. It either was overtaken by another technology or it was pointless, right? We still have fax machines. They're almost gone, but fax machines are fading out. Sending a fax sends us on this really weird journey of how would I do that in modern day? Like, is there even a fax machine in the company? Is there one like on the second floor? The technology will go away. So pointy end of the stick. And then we work all the way backwards to what problem is technology solving? And then how do we access the technology to use it, right? Regardless of what it is. So the CFAA has concepts in it that are rooted in how we use technology. Access, right? Privilege, right? Information, who owns it, where it lives, expectations like of privacy, of security, of ownership, right? So we have these fundamental concepts, just like, assault and battery and physical world, mapping over in a similar context to information and the tools that, manipulate it and use it, and where it lives and what the intent was, right? So if somebody steals information off of my computer by hook or by crook, we understand that, right? Fundamentally, they got access without my permission, right? Some way, right? Which is breaking, right? And then they grabbed up the information purposefully. They have intent. They wanted to get it, right? And then they pulled it out, and they either damaged things on the way out on purpose or on accident. And then they did something with the information. They either sold it or they held it at ransom, right? We can come up with analogs for all these things in the physical world. So the CFA works. Now, where did it break down? Where did it suffer a really big hit? And we cover this in the course that I teach years back when we talk about cyber law, which was Cats versus the U.S., right? So part of it was wiretapping, right? The federal government can, take out a warrant against you with the judge and say, hey, this person is conducting this activity, which is a crime, and Your Honor, we want permission to wiretap them for 30 days, record the conversations. And if I remember the case correctly, Katz was a bookie or working in the illicit gambling space, right? And back when I was a kid, and I don't know when they went away, just like Superman, the phone booth was something you could go in and close the door, right? You would go in and it had a folding glass and metal door, and you're in a box. And it was designed so you could have a conversation without the world interfering. And Katz was leaving his residence or place of business, pardon me, wherever it was, to go across the street to use a payphone to conduct his criminal activity, and the feds were tapping the payphone. In court, he prevailed, Katz, because his lawyer said, wait a second, he was shutting the door to the payphone. So he had expectation of privacy in that little box, right? Unlike a payphone, which started existing more when I was a kid, that just hung on a wall, right? And, on that one, you have no expectation of privacy because anybody who gets next to you to grab the next phone or is waiting for the next bus hears everything you're saying. You're in public. So you can't claim it's private. You can try to whisper, but the box, implied that, the person had the expectation that the world was closed off from them and they were private, right? So that's a technology breakdown, right? The phone conversation requires voice and the user has to speak. And therefore, how we contain their voice is a technology problem, and the box solved the problem. But for the most part, right, that's threading a needle. That's a really great defense attorney threading a needle. The bulk of the CFAA is still valid. It still allows the police and attorneys, prosecutors, to put people away on the fundamental concepts of you illicitly gained access to this system with the intent to cause harm or to steal. You did either or both of those things, and we can prove it, right? And that's what the law does. Compare and contrast to what the ACDC says. The ACDC, in my mind, and we can dig into this, makes two leaps that I think are really tricky, and I'm going to believe this is probably why it got tripped up a couple times and why it's not promulgated as law. Number one, it says that there's a technology we're going to legislate called a beacon. So now the law is going to create a class of technology, if it's passed, called a beacon. And it sounds great because the government is saying this beacon will be a kind of technology that you place in your environment that if a perpetrator gets the beacon or you're able to successfully place the beacon without violating any of the rules of this law, of this act, which are several, the beacon will now solve all of our problems because it's going to collect attributable data. Who the perpetrator really is, right? Where they really are, all the things we really want to know in attribution. We want to know once you've stolen this from us and you've got our beacon and you don't know you have the beacon. Now the beacon can tell the injured party all that information that's been obfuscated. Now we have solved that problem if we believe what the act says. The act says we're going to allow or endorse this class of technology to be created. That's a problem as far as I'm concerned. The second problem I see with the ACDC is we're going to go ahead and come up with a way that rank and file civilians and corporate entities can hit back in some way if they've been hurt. And we're going to create a series of constraints, again, technological constraints that they can't cross, right? But they can go do certain things. I think that suffers from a subset of two problems. There's a technology problem there, right? And there's a interesting, I think, vigilante / lack of law enforcement type professionalism gets cut out, right? We go around the CFAA. We're going to allow people to hurt others in law, right? We're going to allow them to hurt them back or to stop them in a way that today they would not be allowed to do. It's very edgy. We're going to allow it. I think from the technology perspective, the minute we write a law that has all these specific technology constraints, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
We're in trouble that the world could shift and the kind of modalities, the way we work with technology and the way technology comes at us as it evolves and grows, changes the landscape aggressively. Again, the pointy end of the stick. And now some of these rules might not make sense. And then there's either the rules are easily worked around or there's new situations that the rules don't cover. So we have that problem. And then the second problem is, I think, how do we keep this in control? How do we make sure that these new complex privileges we're going to give individuals and organizations, how are we really going to stay on top of it if it was violated or not violated? My good buddy,
your favorite kitty,
my favorite cat who thinks I'm going to play pinball. He comes down here, thinks pinball, so he thinks so Benjamin's going to visit. How do we make sure that people are not using this act to actually hurt people
Right.
and say, no, I'm the offended party. I get to do this.
It was
When in fact,
accidental. I didn't mean to actually hurt you. Yeah.
or
Destroy
I'm
data.
I'm a perpetrator, and I'm going to falsify that you did something wrong to me, and now
Yeah.
I'm going to use my new privileges to hurt you, and you're going to say I never hurt Scott. I'm going to say, but I have records that you did, and I registered per the act that you hurt me. Now I'm striking you back, Jackson.
Yeah.
Now you're a victim, and maybe I'm just smarter than you. Maybe I'm just more capable of the technology and able to do this. So I think creating a privilege class of attackers, and I think there's a couple of articles even indicate we're going to end up with, modern day bounty hunter type cyber types.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, do you want me to go after those people for you? Do you want me to go use my tools and technology to enact this? Creates all kind of interesting, potentially bad liability. So I'm concerned about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you have a perspective. So that's sort of my high level on the CFAA, and then breaking down to the ECDC and why I think CFAA still works.
Yeah.
Why, if you read the thing, and then why the ECDC is so technologically specific.
Yeah, no, that's great. That was a great overview. So I want to dive into more of what you were kind of talking about and this is a great pivot into it, because you kind of touched on it a little bit about the possibility of attacking somebody and not having a clear justification where I could just come after you and attack you, but I could easily just say, well, he attacked me, but we wouldn't be able to really justify that. And it could get out of control, but I have a kind of a unpopular opinion on this. So I believe that the current cybersecurity laws, such as the CFAA, still favor the attackers. I believe that it makes it difficult for organizations to be able to defend themselves effectively. For instance, the CFAA, like Section 1030, criminalizes some defensive measures, even if there are legitimate forms of active cyber defense. That organization, and when I was reading about this, like, it could really leave an organization feeling really powerless if they identified that somebody was in their network and the only way of stopping them could be seen as illegal under the CFAA. So I think that the proposed ACDC, although it didn't pass and there are a lot of things that need to be updated in it, I think ultimately it was a good first step and it started that discussion. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on how our current laws today they do favor the attackers, and what steps do you think that we need to take to update or improve the laws that we have to better support and empower these organizations to defend themselves against these attacks?
I'll use another analog. I don't know that I agree it favors the attackers, but I would say in a free society, it leaves us open. This is the trick of a free society. So I'll pivot it a little differently, and then I'll use a physical analog to explain my logic. In a free society, we're trying to give everybody the maximum amount of room to live their life and to do their thing, right? We're restricting the government. We're restricting legislation. We're restricting oversight because people want to be free.
Yeah.
Right. And then what happens when someone's wronged? Now we have to go suspend some privileges and suspend some rights, right, within limits, just like the Fourth Amendment, right? Now we have to, that's search and seizure, right? The police are not allowed in my home because they're curious. The police are not allowed to dig through my garbage and files because it occurred to them, right? There has to be a process they go through to start infringing my rights, right? Up to and including arresting me, right? And then I go to trial and we see what happens. So getting a warrant, right? Fourth Amendment, the court is going to say, Mr. Rubin has these privileges right up until he starts doing things that are quite criminal in our mind. Your Honor, doesn't this look like a crime to you? When the judge says yes, and then my rights get put on a shelf a little bit while the police go about the process of seeing what I'm up to. What favors the criminal? What stops anybody from storming through my backyard armed, smashing through my windows and taking my family and I hostage, robbing us, and then, maybe even murdering somebody? It could happen. I don't have any kind of security fencing. I don't have walls. I'm not, armed as I walk around my home. So this could happen, right? Somebody could just, it does. There's places in America where, people suddenly find themselves in that kind of situation. Does the law favor the attacker? No, I think the law assumes that that kind of activity is not commonplace, and that the punishments available in the law, right, are enough of a disincentive that people aren't doing that. No one's going to come storm my backyard and do that without some awareness of the penalties they could face, right? They're probably somewhat aware that this is, lots of crimes are being committed here, and I could probably die. I could maybe get the death penalty depending on what I do. So the disincentives, per our, our form of government, tell the public you really shouldn't do that. We're not going to actively patrol Mr. Rubin's home, but at the same time, we're not expecting it. So does it favor the criminal? Well, I would argue if the criminal is not worried about the disincentives, it's quite easy to come attack my home. I'm in the open, right? So I would argue back that the current cyber landscape in the law says, yeah, we expect people to be good actors and not do bad things to others. And if they do, we're going to react. Now, why do I think you have a point here? And why do I think maybe things like the CFAA and other laws are lacking? I'm not worried about the Russian government storming my home. I have a lot of worries in life. I'm not worried about the Russians mounting an attack on me personally. They can't get here without going through a whole lot of trouble. And I just don't suspect I'm a target that the Russians would send the military to come get me in Leesburg, Virginia. Right? It just doesn't seem realistic. However, in the cyber landscape, look what happened in the Colonial Pipeline.
Yeah.
The Russians did that. In the cyber landscape, our backyard is the world. We're open to everything. Anybody who's a bad actor, who's not in our legal system, maybe not even a partner nation where there's some kind of bilateral or multilateral agreement to respect our laws, can be in the backyard taking pot shots at us or storming our home. So that's a different angle we have to think about now, right? Where the analog breaks down. My analog of not worrying in Leesburg, Virginia is not the same as the global landscape. If the Russians decide to target me, they can. And it isn't any harder than targeting the Colonial Pipeline. They just need to figure out where I live, who my internet provider is, who my cell phone provider is, what my presence looks like on the internet, where I work. I'm easily found. And they could make my life miserable. They could, commit all kinds of identity theft, steal my data, smear me, whatever they want to do. So I would say, I don't know that it favors the criminal, but then the disincentives against the really bad actors from, non-nation states, nation states that are adversaries, that's really tricky. And I know you and I talk about this sometimes. That's really problematic. And that's where we can shift gears into what the Biden administration, what the previous Trump administration wanted to do. So again, in a free society, I would say we leave a lot of things open and then try to create the disincentives that match what we perceive the crime will be. Right.
Yeah, so I want to pivot on what you said, though. You talked about your home as one of your examples, and I understood the point that you're coming from, and I want to I want to go a little bit deeper on that and touch on it. If we're comparing that to the cybersecurity space, and you were talking about if somebody broke into your house, I think that one of the things that I'm seeing as a difference here is that right now, if somebody broke into my network, my hands are tied in a lot of ways to do, let's just call it retaliation, and if that's active defense or if that's hacking back. Now, if somebody broke into your house, there are a lot of laws that protect you as the homeowner, that if you did retaliate, you're not breaking the law. And that obviously is also that's area dependent. Because for example, Virginia, you can have guns, you can have concealed carry. DC has a little bit more rigid. So if somebody broke into your home in Virginia and you shot them, for example, the law, depending on, circumstances, it's going to be more in your favor depending on what was happening versus going back to cybersecurity. If somebody was to break into my network, there's a lot like the CFAA, for example, it's not going to allow me to hack back. In a lot of ways, I still have to kind of just sit back for fear of possibly being prosecuted.
I would argue, and I'm afraid to give a reference here because it's been so many years ago. So I don't want to say what organization I took this training through, but it was a Second Amendment style organization. I'm a military vet. I'm a middle of the road political guy, right? But I'm armed. And I grew up in New York where there was a famous case. Again, I'm going to struggle to cite the case, but I think the gentleman was stealing a VCR off a television when the homeowner shot him in the back.
Yeah.
And if I remember the case correctly, New York went, well, wait a second, right? Was that really the level of force necessary? Because the defendant, the homeowner, was not able to show that his life was in danger, and there was no evidence that he attempted to assess if he was in danger. He was executing a guy for stealing a VCR. And it really was a huge thing when I was a kid, was really, what are the limits in your home? So we know, yes, there are states with castle doctrine where I think anything goes. I'm not a lawyer, but castle doctrine, I decide you don't belong in my home and you don't belong at my home. I remember the training I got, and I think it's akin to the CFAA in cyber, where it said, if someone ends up in my home and I'm armed, the best position I can be in is a position where I remember the instructions was to call the police, to tell them there's someone in my home. So I'm alerting the authorities I'm in trouble, and to tell them I'm armed, so they know I have a gun, and then to leave the phone line open, and then to yell out, get out of my home, I'm armed, so it gets recorded that I took the active step to say, I'm fearing for my life. I don't want you in my home, and I'm officially scared, and my family and I are worried, right? And then when you come into my last stand, my bedroom, I shoot you in the front, not in the shoulder, in the back, as you're in my doorway. So I didn't execute you out of retaliation or out of retribution. I executed you because you were coming to kill me. I can't flee any further. So it was explained to me in so many words. It was a training course. So this is the situation where you're probably going to be the most okay. I'm going to place the gun down. I'm going to put my hands up. The authorities are going to come. I'm probably going to get handcuffed. They're going to have to figure out who the heck shot who and when and where. And ultimately in court, the jury should see that I made clear I'm scared for my life. I have nowhere left to turn. The authorities aren't here, and danger is at my face. Now, CFAA is technical. It's a little different. Right? So the perpetrators of my network, what am I allowed and not allowed to do? There's been issues about honeypots. Am I allowed to entice bad guys with honeypots and fool them that there's a whole network while they play around, and then trap them, like a spider, and go after them? What are we really encouraging, right? What are we really out to get? Am I allowed to do equal damage to them because now I know who they are that came through? And I mean, that's what I think the ACDC starts to address. You and I have discussed this before. We have this fundamental problem with attribution. The person who comes into my home, who either ends up with their hands on their head or dead, is physically there. We've established who they are, right? When the authorities come in and either collect the person or the body, we have established attribution. That guy, right? Doesn't matter where he came from. We got the guy. You can't remotely do that to me. Well, with cyber, you and I know this, and I think the general cyber public know this. It's stupid to attack an environment from my home network. I'm just inviting trouble. Even if I live in a place where it's tough to prosecute me, it just creates attribution. It puts pressure on me unnecessarily. It just alerts the world to where I am. It makes it harder for me to be threatening. So I'm going to take care to work through an intermediary that was not careful enough to keep me out or was willing to allow me, right? So now we shoot that guy. Well, that guy was actually a hostage held in front of the shooter. The shooter's got the gun, through the side, and I'm shooting the hostage. That's problematic. And I've said many times, I'm on record, well, people ought to take better care of their networks so they don't end up hostages. Right? Try to do a better job so you're not a hostage. However, I think the hostage has a case to say, hey, wait a second, I didn't deserve any of this. And I've got legal rights to pursue damages against all these parties. Or my home government might not respect what you did. So my government may be able to take action against you because you're not allowed to just hack through me. You don't have that privilege. So I think that's the issues we have with going back. We can actively block. We can cut off the perpetrator. We can take defensive measures. We can't hurt them. The ACDC says, well, wait, let's create a vehicle with this beacon so that we can, place this tracing device
Yeah.
into the package that the bad guy takes home with them. And let's wait. Let's wait for the beacon to wake up and tell us where it is. Now we know who to go. Now, after the crime, after the incident is done, after the hacking activity has ceased and things have calmed down and we've repaired the wall, we've patched our holes, we've adjusted our permissions, we've disciplined the employees that were uncareful with passwords. Now the beacon goes off. It's a month later. Wow.
Yeah.
Now I have privileges for what? Not restitution, retribution.
Yeah.
Right. There's no, they have my data. They got a copy. Maybe I'm hoping if they encrypted it for ransomware, I'm going to try to find their codes. Now I'm going to go break into their environment. Right. And try to establish that. Or am I really going to just get retribution? Right. And I think that's where we have to be so careful about what we're going to endorse and allow people to do before law enforcement has a say.
Yeah, that's a great question. When is an active cyber defense turning into retribution?
Right.
That's a great question. Yeah, and just defining that.
I'm fairly certain in the state of Virginia, if I'm being recorded or I've got cameras and I get a perpetrator and they put their hands up and they get on their knees and they say they're sorry and they're unarmed and they shouldn't be in my home, and I then shoot them, I'm pretty sure I'm in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I'm in terrible trouble explaining, even if I was emotional, why I execute them.
Yeah.
It's going to be the same thing with retribution. Why were you back inside that environment in that country? Well,
6 months later. Right.
Yeah. I was digging around, looking for information and profiling them and closing, I saw them doing bad stuff. I decided to shut some of that off. And now what?
Yeah. So pivoting on that, another part of that ACDC still in this space, one of the sections of the ACDC that I actually was like, wow, I didn't even know that this was possible, was they called it the sunsetting, but it really was talking about a pilot program and I'm wondering if we can create a pilot program to basically, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I was thinking maybe test new cybersecurity law. And in doing so, possibly sunsetting portions of that CFAA and doing it over, I think the proposed time was over a 2-year time. And I'm just curious, what are the potential benefits or the downfalls of creating a program to test new cybersecurity, I'm saying I could not be right, that could be totally wrong, but testing it before passing it into law.
So I would say I'm a fan of the test. And I think their intention there was, I'd have to kind of read into these congressmen's heads a little bit, was the idea being that we know technology is transitory and it changes. And so we don't want this to be forever. So we'll build in a fuse, which exists in other legislation, that forces us to go back and revisit this and either end the law or modify it or continue it. Right. And that's a popular idea. I would have gone about this another way. And I think if I was one of the staffers involved in Congress, I would have gone at this another way. The way I would have gone at this, I would have said, this beacon idea should be a law enforcement tool, not in the hands of civilians to try to puzzle out restitution or retribution. And I think what ought to happen, I like the registry idea. I've been attacked, I've been wronged, and I had the privilege to choose to leave a beacon in my system that law enforcement gave me as a defensive tool. So law enforcement's going to give me this tool, and it's sort of like a seed. It just sits in my network. I tailor it per what law enforcement advises me. It's not phoning home. It's not surveilling me. It's this thing in my network that law enforcement gave me as an active defense. Should I be attacked, if it's captured this beacon with the data that's stolen from me, right? I can activate it, or it's activated in some way, right? And if it's activated, only then can law enforcement start tracking it and getting involved. So now this beacon is actually property of the U.S. government. This beacon is no different than when I think I'm going to try to use another physical analog. The police will often, when they have well, at least the shows I watch, my wife loves these crime shows. If they think you murdered somebody and you hid the body and you're the number one suspect, the police might mess with you to get you to go back and check on the body. So would they sneak a GPS tracker into your car, right? They get permission to do that. And then when they spook you enough, you start revisiting the gravesite to make sure no one's touched it. But they're tracking you on GPS, and then ultimately you've shown your hand, and now they go out there and they dig it up. We got it, right? I would argue in the cyber domain, if you were to give me that tracker and say, Scott, this tracker is, activatable by you or activatable under certain circumstances, but only law enforcement will know. So no personal information will be shared, none of your data will be shared. But if it's damaged or touched, it's tripwired in some way. You can tell law enforcement something bad has happened to you. Law enforcement can start fishing around for the tracker. Maybe the NCIJTF or CISA is now got you on a watch list. And when your trigger, your beacon wakes up and hits the real internet or the dark web, if CISA or NCIGTF are notified, we now have really strong legislative law enforcement methods to go get you restitution, right? And law enforcement will do that for you, with you. We're not going to ask you to do that. Law enforcement, the experts here, are going to contain the evidence, work with the other, parties, whether it's overseas or from another state or whatever, to work out all of the jurisdictional rules, and then from there, collect evidence, right, as professional law enforcement does, work with the prosecutor and prosecute on your behalf. Unless it's a TV show like The Rockford Files or, Murder, She Wrote, we don't ask you to personally get involved in a murder investigation of a loved one. We ask you to give statements. We ask you to give information. Law enforcement's supposed to do that in the real world. And you're available to law enforcement for filling in the blanks and providing background and being witness impact. We don't say, well, why don't you sneak a bug into the suspect and let us know if the murderer, you do your own investigation. We'll link up later on the back.
Yeah.
Like law enforcement doesn't like that. I'm fairly certain they don't want, people doing that. So I would say this would have stood personally a better chance is if they left the technology piece out and made that a tool that law enforcement could use, one of many kinds of tools, and not legislating a beacon and the 2-year period. Then I don't think it would even need a time period. I think they would say, we're going to give law enforcement enhanced tech, and law enforcement will work with you to see if it can live in your environment. You can activate. It's your choice. Maybe even for civilians, maybe even for regular people. I'm beacon enabled. I'm going to allow law enforcement to, I think the example maybe with alarm systems, right? The alarm system is going to contact the police, right? The Rubens house has been invaded. Even though that model's a little wonky, it's going to do it for me. Maybe the beacon, I can say to the police, my house, this horrible cyber activity has been perpetrated on me. Do your thing.
I like that. So, I think that this could be a plausible option to be presented as a solution to create a pilot program that utilizes not only beacons, but let's look at the scope of just active cyber defensive measures, creating really defining what an ACDM is, and then using the pilot program to help define the scope of the federal agencies, such as the FBI, to help overall enforcing law and protecting against cyber threats. And it could be a voluntary program for organizations to participate in. But I also think that maybe the initial focus could be critical infrastructure, and that's Certainly. The big push with the national cybersecurity strategy. And this could be part of that pilot program of strengthening our critical infrastructure as part of this pilot program. I think that could be definitely something. And I like the home alarm, because I think that does a great job of explaining how this could be utilized in a more simple understanding of hey, you have a home alarm. The law enforcement don't have access to your home. They can't just go into your network, because I think that could be a concern. But if it's triggered, then at that point in time, they could have access to your home, because now it could be you could have an adversary in your network or a criminal in your home.
I think there's two things. I think as we're engineering a solution here to fix this, in my mind, we're playing with this idea of fixing it, is two things. That you're giving industry the chance to get innovative, which is what we want in a free society. We don't want to dictate a tool in the law and then have to live with that tool. We want industry to innovate. So imagine if you work at one of these networking or cyber defense companies and law enforcement is now saying, we're going to have this, well, what's the law enforcement dog? It's the bloodhound and the raincoat.
Canine, you mean?
McGruff. Is it McGruff?
Oh no, I don't know. McGruff.
I'm from the '80s. Yeah, so it was the cartoon dog. Hey kids, don't do drugs. Turn those guys in. Wow. And McGruff was a dog in like a raincoat, like an investigator. And what we're saying is the modern McGruff or whatever it is that hey, place this technology in your environment. It's not patrolling your environment. It's not actually connected to law enforcement. It's dormant, right? And if something bad happens, it either alarms or you can alarm it or both. And hey, industry, what should be in there? How should that thing work? Yes, it'll get attribution, but then industry can spend energy and time and innovation, making it better, making it cool, working with law enforcement and civilians. So the law is not dictating the innovation or how it works, right? But this is a thing that's going to tell us all about who the bad guy is when something bad happens. And the bad guys might not always know what the payload is. So it's not a beacon. It could be a lot of things.
Yeah.
Right. It could be all kinds of things. And now we're, enabling law enforcement with a stronger tool to determine what happened to you and connecting attribution back to the event. Right. I think we're addressing that, and we're getting rid of this retribution piece, which I just personally think won't go well. I don't care what the registry is for. I'm notifying you like a bail bondsman or I'm going to go after Jax. And now we're just hoping law enforcement goes, sounds good. You're number 35. Go ahead. Right. And it seems, I can't imagine anybody in law enforcement is going to be excited about that.
And I think it's clear to define for anybody that's watching this, some of the, like when you think of active cyber defensive measures, they couldn't, outside it, like you were saying, there's more than just beaconing. It's like honeypots, honey nets, like things like that could be on your network that if triggered or if an adversary hits a honeypot or gets into a honey net, that is when there's an alert that goes off, and it goes back to that alarm where it's like, okay, triggers a law enforcement. Now we're going to bring them in, inform them, and let them know what's happening. But I think the other piece is, like you said, really defining when it goes into retribution. What does that look like? I think for me, looking at it as a professional, it's going to be a time frame. Like I would think that after a certain period of time, after the attack has happened, mitigation has gone into place. If after this period of time that beacon doesn't go off, for example, then you can't retaliate, because after 3 months that does turn into retribution.
I think it turns into the same idea as the bail bondsman. The bail bondsman can't go after you until all the right steps have been created to enable the bail bondsman to go get their money back, or to, for somebody to go capture you to collect on the bond. You're a convicted criminal. You split out on the trial. The bond is, has to be paid, on and on and on. Those are triggers that are set up where everyone understands what happened in the front. I wish I could show a video clip if I was more multimedia savvy. And it's one of my favorite scenes in Raising Arizona, the Coen Brothers movie, where John Goodman, and I can't remember who his cohort is, they open up the bag, the money bag from the bank they robbed, and it explodes the blue ink, and they're in a car. And the entire car becomes just solid blue ink over them, over everything. Like,
I found it.
That's the beacon. That's the beacon. Like, whenever they hit the ink bomb, they're not washing that off. We all know who they are. We know what they did. It's hilarious. Anybody sees that, it's like, what the heck happened there? And we see the bag. We know what they did. I mean, so again, you're giving this technology an opportunity to do that. You're giving law enforcement and the public a really great way to get to the bottom of it without retribution, without muddying the landscape of, after they attacked me, I followed these steps, which are many. And some of them, maybe they're going to say I misstepped.
Yeah.
Now it muddies the case. Oh, I hurt them. Well, now there's, they have legislative angle back on me, and I didn't fundamentally get the attribution at the exact right time. And now there's loopholes. Yep. All of a sudden we end up in this, right? Yep. Nothing good comes from that.
No, not at all.
It's
Yeah,
just me.
I found the clip. It's pretty funny. Raising Arizona. I was doing the arrow where you go across the bottom of it and you can see the video. But it was pretty funny. Yeah, they stuck
It's
a
just
blue bottle in there.
it's just such a classic example of they know they're busted. You're
Uh-huh.
not getting past that.
That's all.
And if the beacon did that, if the beacon either surreptitiously or actively
Yeah.
identified, the bad people that have it, there's no denying it. They're not
Yeah.
getting away from it. Everyone around them knows who they are now, and maybe more. And you know,
And if they're burned, that's the other thing in the community too. It's a big deal in the threat community. It's threat actors. If you're a nation state or if you're a hacker and then you're identified and you're attributed, I mean, you're burned. It's like getting a job. Nobody's going to hire you
no one's
again.
going to work with you. Yeah,
No,
you got busted.
you're
You're in
out.
danger, and you might now be an informant.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
can't
Like
talk to
nobody
you.
wants to work with you ever again.
Right.
So yeah, it gets to that. Now we're putting people out of business in a way. Like you're done. So
So my summary is, if we're working to get attribution, if that's really what we want to do, we should be focused on technological ways to do that, and then working within the framework of the law that helps law enforcement do its job, as opposed to getting the attribution through some legislative tool and then telling people, here's your hammer, go hit them. My personal opinion.
I like it. All right. How much more time do we have on your end, Scott? We're going into 51 minutes. Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Yes.
All right,
We
cool.
do.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk on the national cybersecurity strategy. It
Mm-hmm.
recently came out. I think it was this month, even though March
Mm-hmm.
is almost over, but it was early in the month, March 3rd, I think.
Right.
So the recent release of the national cybersecurity strategy included some really bold objectives, in my personal opinion. To use, for example, all instruments of national power to disrupt and dismantle threat actors and prevent them from threatening the national security of the United States. That was a quote from there. However, as we've discussed throughout this discussion, some of the challenges presented within the CFAA, I'm just wondering how we can truly empower these organizations to defend themselves against these cyber attacks and take action on these malicious actors when we still have the CFAA. So if you can kind of talk a little bit on that, and be interested.
I'll give you my 2 minutes on it. I read the whole thing, and we've had these conversations before. I don't get excited about executive orders or about executive plans, especially when they're asking for Congress, please create these laws or regulations. And it's not that I'm angry at the government for doing it. What I'm saying is they tend to be without teeth. The strategy had a lot of, I read it like an academic, I read my students' papers, hope and please, and we'd love to see, these kind of statements of, Congress, if you create this law or create this kind of regulatory structure, we'll go use it, right? So it's a call out to Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Several of those, I think that's important, but it's not actionable yet.
Right.
So the document is saying, we're focused as an executive branch of the government to go do these things, but we need the authorities, we need the enhanced authorities, and we need help from the rest of the government. So we can move some of the chess pieces around with CISA and NSA and NCI JTF and all that. But fundamentally, to get real teeth in this thing, we need Congress to create the legislation to enhance what this thing says.
Yeah.
So I think that document serves two purposes. I think it tells the American public this is where the administration's thinking. That's good. So it's good to know the thought process. The second thing, it tells industry, my opinion, as a consultant, this is where the executive branch wants to see creativity in the products and services that it intends to go procure at the agency level. When we say we're going to ask this agency to study this problem, well, that agency is then probably going to put out an RFP or go to industry for an RFI, a request for information, and say, hey, how do we do that? And there's a chance for me to pitch. Yeah. Hey, CISA, here's an active defense tech, or here's a very interesting new way of using AI/ML to solve this problem. So I think industry is hoping to see that this leads to ideas in agencies. My hope is, as an academic, is that Congress takes up the 5 or 6 or 7 places where it says enhance, build, or modify legislation to give us this power, so then they can go use budget and authority to go do it. Because remember, the president can't arbitrarily change the budget and say, well, I'm going to use this for active cyber defense. I know this money was sent over for protecting fruits and vegetables from,
Right.
stink bugs, but it's really more important I use it here. The president doesn't have that authority, right? So the president needs to get a budget. So I think if the legislation's picked up, if you're a fan of anything in there, then, tell your congressmen and senators, give the White House this authority, create this bill.
Yeah. Yeah. And there wasn't a lot of things too surprising in the national cybersecurity strategy. It was a lot of repeating, data sharing, private public partnerships, which we've been harping on. It did, in my opinion, take a more of a like you said, it was we need to do this kind of thing, but I felt like it was being more direct. And one of the areas for one of the final questions was about that public and private sector collaboration. And when I say it was more direct, is they, in my opinion, created a little bit more of a path on how to get there. And I'll add some of what the actual NCSS states, which was the National Cybersecurity Strategy discussed ways to scale collaboration by leveraging the cybersecurity information security agencies, we know as CISA, and the sector risk management agencies known as SRMAs. And they were talking about utilizing these two entities to coordinate with critical infrastructure. So again, going back to that critical infrastructure. However, there are many other private sector entities, when I was reading this, that it really didn't talk about, and that included small businesses. And I feel like they also play a vital role in sustaining American cybersecurity and national security. So do you think that this document has an effectively outlined an approach to create these private and public relationships beyond just critical infrastructure? Do you think it was too focused in that space?
No. And I'll give you my 2 minutes on that. When you look at public-private partnerships, which could be a whole other hour, going past that term into how it really works with all the layers of interaction. Basically, it's the government saying, we're trying to keep the pendulum in the middle. We don't want to overly legislate and control your industry or nationalize your industry, but we don't want to swing the pendulum where we look the other way in your industry and we just know it exists and we don't really know what it is. It's the government saying, we're trying to come to a middle place where we're going to regulate to some degree how you operate, and you're going to be compliant with it, and you have a very active hand at the table in creating those rules. The federal government is not going to outright create the rules on how you operate your nuclear reactor or how you outright operate your trading business, but the government's going to create some rules once we've asked for public opinion on the safest, smartest way to do that. You as industry can contribute to that. You will. And then that rule, we're going to enforce it. You help write it, we're going to enforce it. And the rule is an administrative function that we can say, if you violate the rule, you either got to pay money or you got to, make restitution. I think critical infrastructure is where that has to be done first, because right now critical infrastructure doesn't have that for cyber, and it's such a really scary spot, again, since Colonial Pipeline, right? We were impacted here on the East Coast quite badly. I think it can't be promulgated down to the small business and the medium business or the non-SIP business yet, because we haven't really, back to your earlier point, tried this out. Like you talked about these 2-year trials. We haven't really tried this out, cyber and SIP industry, and working together and actively supporting and defending that world. I think we need to figure that out before we get the really great lessons learned of, hey, this applies to business in general.
Yeah, and I think we're a little, on my professional opinion, I think as the United States, we're a little bit behind in our agility and our laws. And I think that the NCSS was a good first step, but there, like you said, there's no real teeth behind it. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 1 to 2 years as far as congressional leaders coming on board. And hey, maybe we just figured out the solution, Scott. Maybe we need to go to our congressional leader and create this beaconing or ACDM program that empowers law enforcement as well as the public sector or the private sector. So you never know.
Maybe. We'll I'm a fan.
We'll see. All right. So final thoughts. Final thoughts, Scott? We're going to do a wrap. What would you like to say? Any final thoughts?
My final thought is, I think it's great that Americans in general are getting smarter about cyber and smarter about protecting their information. You made the point, we're not where the GDPR is with Europe. We don't yet have that kind of structure here with privacy and the defense of it. But what's dangerous is technology and its features are outstripping, right, our understanding of cyber. So as we're getting smarter, technology is getting more and more and more intense and interesting by the moment, right? So I do think it's high time the folks that are really spending time in the space and concerned like we are, reach out to your elected representatives, reach out to people and say, hey, let's come up with the right kind of enabling legislation, smart legislation to put the money where it matters and the authority where it works, in smart steps. Let's come up with those smart steps sooner than later. And I think we'll be better off as opposed to some kind of big sweeping activity, big bang activity. Let's come up with the smart steps that get us there.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to revisit the ACDC. It may not have been the perfect bill that was presented, but it was a first step, and that could always be the first discussion that you bring up to your congressional leader to start having that talk with them. So, again, Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show. Always love to have you here.
Thank
Always
you so
bring a
much
wealth of
for
knowledge.
having me. And
thanks for your cat doing a guest presence.
He was just here again. He's very jealous, so he was just bringing his toy to attack. So it probably got on the audio. But Benjamin says thanks for having him too.
He's so cute.
He's hilarious.
Cooper's over here just passed out. He's over it. He's like, Mom does this all the time. I'm not even impressed. So over it. All right, Scott. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
everyone.
It's a pleasure.